Response Initiative at GCC has invited them to come to tell us about their direct experiences and to then reflect a little bit 6 months later on what is going on now and perhaps some thoughts about what can any of us do who are not involved in human services. I'd like to introduce who we have invited today. This is Mary Snyders, and she is from the local chapter of the Red Cross.
Hampshire County.
Hampshire County, I'm sorry. And she is the Director of Emergency Services. And I know that you went down yourself.
I did not go down. I will be going down.
You will be going down.
Yeah.
Okay. Next we have Marianne Gallagher, who is at the University Child Care Center. And she did a piece of work providing some child care for people who were involved in the World Trade Center. And last we have Josh Miller, who is a professor at the Smith College School of Social Work, who has done a lot of work with critical incident stress debriefings and works for our local crisis team, the Community Crisis Support Options, and in fact did a piece for us here at GCC, which was very helpful. And he also works for the local chapter of the Red Cross and a local EMS team. So the way the format will be today is we're going to hear from about their experiences and then have the audience feel free to ask some questions. Okay, so thank you. Okay,
it appears that I've been elected to start this, and so again, my name is Mary Snyders, and I am Director of Emergency and Volunteer Services for all of Hampshire County, and I work very closely with our sister chapters, which would be Franklin County, which covers Greenfield Community College. And the primary role or mission of the Red Cross is we are a humanitarian, volunteer-led emergency agency, and our purpose is to prepare people to protect themselves, respond to, and recover from disaster instances. And unfortunately, that has now encompassed weapons of mass destruction, which I've been focusing a lot of my training the last couple of weeks on, are being better prepared to meet those needs. As far as what actually happened on September 11th and what the Red Cross response was, when the first tower came down, the Director of Emergency Services for the New York chapter actually was at Ground Zero because she had heard saw the plane crash, and didn't even realize to the extent of what was going on, and she decided with her having the more experience, she left everybody back at the chapter so as not to put them in harm's way, and she went down to assess the situation and determine what the response was going to be and how we needed to initiate it. 6 months later, we have collected over $900 million. $598 million of that has already been distributed, and the remainder of it is expected to be distributed by September 11th of 2002. It's being overseen by former, I think he was a Congressman Mitchell, I can't remember. I try not to get involved in national things. I have enough trouble with my own chapter. Senator Mitchell, okay. And then to date, we have served over 14 million meals and snacks. We've assisted over 22,000 homes, residents that were impacted by the destruction, not within the towers, but the surrounding collateral damage. Initially, and most people didn't realize this, when it first started, there were over 30,000 people in shelters in Manhattan following this incident. And that was because they either could not get back to their apartments because they were blocked off, or their apartments were not there anymore. We have done, and Josh is going to speak to that, we have done over 22,000 situation of crisis debriefing, mental health cases that have been opened. On the local level here in Hampshire County, besides, accepting the donations that were flooding in, we had a tremendous spontaneous volunteer response to the point that people could not get into the chapter building because there was no room. They were already backed up and out into the street. That was a tremendous challenge for us. How can we utilize them? Everybody wanted to help. Not everybody can go to Ground Zero. And so there was this intense need from the community, and this was experienced all over the country, to, if you can't go there, at least you've got to be able to go and do something. And there was, we've gotten a lot of great volunteers out of it. I'm continuing to try to nurture those that came in, and now that life is settling in again, the big challenge is how to appropriately use them in a meaningful way, both for them and to meet a need that the chapter has. And we had one paid staff and 3 volunteers that went. Candace LaFleur, like Josh, is a disaster mental health specialist, and she was attached to one of the recovery teams that was at Ground Zero. She did their debriefing almost on an hourly basis as they came out. From there, they moved her over to where, I think it was Pier 92, which is where the body identification and collection sites were. So the other 2 volunteers went down and worked in a capacity of coordinating volunteers. I can't imagine. I know what happened at my door. I can't even begin to imagine what happened down in New York and Virginia, in Pennsylvania. I mean, it just had to have been overwhelming. So they had volunteers there. I also had a director that went to, he was the job director of the Twin Towers. On the local side, my mental health workers and people that volunteered were helping the community deal with the crisis and the situation. We were impacted even if we didn't lose a loved one. Just the sheer terror of our having been affected by an outside source was just devastating to people. I had parents calling saying that my 4-year-old is building towers out of Lego blocks and crashing airplanes into them. What do I do? How do I treat them? And so we had a lot of that. We had some United Airline attendants that live in our local area that all had to be debriefed before they could return to work. So it impacted us here locally. We have a couple of families that lost siblings at the Pentagon that we are still in fairly close contact with and provided assistance. So it's an ongoing, continual effort, and it will be going on for a long time. The Oklahoma bombing happened in 1995. We are still assisting the families impacted by that bombing 7 years later. So that's kind of a general overview, and I'll pass to Josh, who has more specifics.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Well, it's really a pleasure to be talking to all of you about this today. And it actually helps me to be able to share what happened and talk to people. That's part of how those of us who had the privilege of doing some disaster relief work also get some help ourselves, which is talking about it with others or writing about it or just, in a sense, sharing it. I facilitated critical incident stress debriefings and other crisis intervention activities basically in 3 locations, in New York City, in Boston, and in Western Massachusetts. Now, you might ask yourself, well, you know, if this happened at the World Trade Center, why all these different places? And I think one of the most unusual things about what happened on September 11th, which Mary, I think, was alluding to, is none of us were outside of it. Usually when there's a disaster or a traumatic occurrence, there are people who are not directly affected who can be helpful to people who have been directly or secondarily affected. But in this instance, I think all of us in this country, and probably most people in the world, were really stunned by what happened, and we had our own emotional reactions to deal with. So here in Western Massachusetts, I was actually here working with some of you. At Smith College, I had to do debriefings, not just for the students, but also for the college administrators, who are carrying a lot of responsibility, and faculty. As Mary said, the Red Cross was doing debriefings in the community because if people had had a history of having experienced disasters or trauma, sometimes this re-triggered their emotions, or if they worked for an airline company, they thought to themselves, this could have been me. That's one of the reasons I went to Boston. I did some debriefing with people who were travel agents, And part of and they also worked on in a very high building on one of the top floors. So they had two things that were making them really upset. One was that they might have sold tickets to some of the people who were on the planes who died, and also they were fearful for their own safety working in tall buildings. What I want to focus on today is my work in New York. And what happened is there were so many different organizations that sent people to New York to do the kind of work I was doing: the Red Cross, Emergency Medical Services, the National Organization of Victim Assistance. And I went with a managed care company. Managed care companies were hiring clinicians like myself who have been trained for the most part in doing this type of work to go work with employees who had been in the World Trade Center and had survived. So there was this company, and I was assigned to work with about 800 employees who had been relocated a few blocks away from the World Trade Center on a place called Canal Street, which is a little bit north of the World Trade Center in New York. When you think about it, there's like so many different groups of people that needed services, and they had different needs. So there were the people like the employees who I was working with. There were relatives of people who had died or were missing at the time, because this was just in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. There were children. There were uniformed people who were really upset because their fellow firefighters or police officers had died in the line of service. There were people who saw it firsthand. There were people, as Mary said, who lived near there who were displaced. So there were all these different groups of people needing services. I also stayed in a place called Tribeca, which is a neighborhood that borders the financial district where the World Trade Center is. So not only was I doing the debriefing, but I was living in the security zone. And just to quickly give you a picture of that, the security zone was cordoned off. Anything south of Canal Street, you had to, if you were driving through, you had to actually have authorization, and you were stopped by police, and there were thousands of police officers. I've never seen so many police officers in New York all the time on the streets. People were talking to each other, which is another thing, if you're from New York, doesn't go on all that often. People were really worried about each other's welfare and talking to each other in the street. There was smoke from the smoldering Ground Zero, and that just continued for weeks. And at night, there were floodlights that would shine on it because the recovery workers needed to see what they were doing. And it was very ghostly, the plumes of smoke going up where the World Trade Center used to be. There were posters of people who were missing on walls and on fences. There were yellow ribbons with messages to people who had died or people who were working. There were cordons of people on street corners cheering the recovery workers as they would get bused to Ground Zero. And every fire station in the city that I saw had black bunting and flowers and installations and pictures of people. So that was kind of the scene. Let me quickly tell you about what people were experiencing, at least the people who I was working with. And one of the challenges was that the people who I was working with, we had never worked together. And some of us had been trained, like I've been trained by the Red Cross and by other organizations. Some of them had not been trained. So we came in using different ideas about how to help people. So we had to quickly form teams and reach a consensus about what we could best do. First of all, what people saw, their experiences. How many people here saw the thing on Sunday night, 9/11? Okay, a few of you did. Well, for those of you who saw it, that's what they saw. Some of the people I was debriefing were on the 70th floor of Tower 2. So they were in their offices, and suddenly they saw papers, just debris flying through the air. And they were wondering, what are all these papers in the air for? Then they went to the side where they could see the other tower, and they saw really horrible things. The fire, they saw people jumping. They saw people burning. And I'm saying this, I know it's very graphic, but I want to give you a sense of how horrible an experience this was for people. They then were being evacuated from their building. And of course, there was a sense of fear about that, getting down from the 70th or 74th floor to the bottom. About 2/3 of the way down, an announcement came on over the loudspeaker and told them to go back to their offices. Because people didn't realize that the second tower was going to be hit. And there was mass confusion. People really didn't understand what was happening. Was this a war? Was this terrorism? Was it a fire? I mean, it was really too much to grasp. And in fact, that was one of the most common things that people said. It was like, I felt like I was in a dream. I felt like I was watching a movie. They just couldn't make sense of what was going on. It also led to feelings of guilt, because those people who I spoke to who survived because they disobeyed that announcement to go back to their offices, or they were late for work and had not yet entered the building. So in some ways, not being a loyal, great, obedient worker was actually functional in this instance. People heard terrible things, they smelled terrible things. So I'm saying that because one of the things that happens is your senses really pick this stuff up. And one of the things we had to do is talk about what people heard, smelled, and saw, because those types of things were setting them off in the days that followed. If they heard an airplane, that would set them off. If they were in a high building or had to cross a bridge or take a subway, that might set them off. If they smelled burning or smoke, that would set them off. So if they heard screams, because there was screaming everywhere, that would set them off. People experience lots of different emotions: fear, disbelief, numbness. A lot of people just switched off while this was going on. Depression, and also anger. And as I said, guilt. Physically, people were nauseous. They had lost their appetite. They had trouble sleeping. They had nightmares. Excuse me. People sometimes felt very socially isolated. There was a sense that if other people had not gone through this, then they couldn't understand it, even their partners or children or friends. The other side of that, though, is they did feel as if people who they worked with and had gone through, there was a lot of support. The meaning of this. Why me? Why did I survive? Three things that I think I want to finish this up with that were really inspiring for me were, first of all, most of the people that I met with were healing. Despite having gone through this terrible, terrible ordeal, their symptoms, the things I've been describing, were definitely starting to go down. If somebody was having nightmares, instead of it being every night, it would be 2 nights a week. This was 3 weeks, let's say, after the event. If they had had trouble eating for the first week or so, they were now starting to eat again, even though they weren't back to their full appetite. So I guess one thing I want to say is the human ability to recover and human resiliency was very apparent to me as I was doing this work. Second thing is people were really reevaluating what is important to them. They were really thinking, what do I want to do with my life? Why do I worry when I'm getting caught in traffic? Is that really worth it? It was really kind of helping them sort out what was important in their lives and what was not so important. And they were really taking stock and thinking. And the third thing is it really made people aware of how important their relationships were and how they couldn't take those relationships for granted. And they were acutely aware of this because some of their colleagues had not survived. So they were certainly letting people who they loved know that they loved them and being very conscious of that connection with other people. So I think I'll leave on that positive note. And for me, actually, in the end, although it was definitely not easy to go through this, it was really actually a very inspiring educational experience for me, and I was really privileged to have had that opportunity. Okay. Marianne.
Thanks. Excuse me. I volunteered for 2 weeks in New York City at Worth Street Center, which was had been set up in addition to the Family Assistance Center at Pier 94 for folks who were doing services. And this was the first time I had been involved with a disaster response of any kind. I think that the evening news on September 11th, the image of the shell of the building with the enormous mound of debris that was there. You talked about those the physical experiences. I remembered as a kid looking up at the World Trade Center and not being able to see the top. And seeing that image on the news that night put me back to having grown up in New Jersey and New York, spending time in the city right there, and grasping the understanding of the enormity of this event that I had never had in previous disasters. And having spoken with folks during this experience who had been in Oklahoma. And I remember hearing about that, and I remember seeing pictures about that, but it didn't something was different for me in this piece of just that image and having those memories from my life there. That right away got me asking, well, what can I do? Hearing the numbers at that time, much higher than what thankfully has been the results now, but how many thousands of people could have been in that building that day, and how many thousands of people were going to be impacted here. And didn't really know, and was fairly unsettled for a while, and then happened to see an article in the newspaper talking about the Family Assistance Center that was set up in New York City in conjunction with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, I think, and the City of New York. And that in the article about what was services that were provided there, I saw childcare among the variety of things, and thought, well, I know how to do childcare. So this is something I can find out, how can I contribute to? And had to go to the site, actually, to find out about it. Imagining this huge infrastructure of support services that are set up in a matter of days. Well, everybody's got cell phones and new phones, but there's no published phone numbers. So ended up finding out about it by going to the site, to the Family Assistance Center. And as I got to find out about what they were doing for services, it wasn't put on the TV and plug the kids in over here while their parents are doing work. It was really meeting kids' needs while their parents were having some of their needs met in the assistance center, and that was very impressive to me. And found out about they were doing training for local volunteers, and got hooked up into a training and returned a couple weeks later to do volunteer work. The disaster child care programming is coordinated by a group in the Church of the Brethren, Emergency Response Service Ministries, that works in conjunction with, through Red Cross and FEMA on a variety of disasters that have occurred. They've been doing this for now 20 years, which was another piece that when I went to the site and found out about it, I was like, I've been in the field almost 20 years. I've never heard about this aspect of early childhood programming. So I had opportunity to learn a whole lot professionally, as well as then have that personal connection and answer that question of what can I do. I was able to find something that I could do that would meet those needs. There was the site that I worked out, as I mentioned, was on Worth Street, was about 5 blocks from Ground Zero. And the families that were coming to that assistance center, some of which were families of victims, but mostly the families that we saw there were people who had lived in the area or worked in the area, many of whom worked in the building. And the goal of the child care facility is to have a place for the kids to be, while, if you can imagine, you described the setting of the downtown imagery. Well, you come into an assistance center and would be on lines for most of the day, all of these thousands of people coming in for help. And many of whom either were not willing to part with their children because of all that had gone on in their lives, or whose schools were closed because they lived in the area and the schools were closed for a number of weeks. So the family would come to seek assistance. And the program was set up so that and the site where I was I think it had been a waiting area for Division of Motor Vehicles. So it was sort of, here's some room, set it up for kids. And with Play-Doh and blocks and trucks and cars, a lot of emergency response vehicles, fire trucks and the emergency ambulances and things, because the kids need to play that out. When you talked about the kids building with the Legos, that was happening, painting and drawing materials. So really open-ended materials available to the children. Now, one of the pieces I kept thinking about was, these kids have never seen me before. They've never been to this building before. They're leaving their parents in their context of their family unit right now, which is stressed. So even just having the child transition into the program, in the classroom, that in itself, for some of the little ones, could have been traumatic. And how the volunteers who had been trained, both in New York or had been part of this programming before, that those skills and those trainings to say be responsive to the child and start where they are and bring them in, made the difference and made it be a place that was a good place for kids to be, while their parents were having to concentrate on filling out lots of forms and lots of paperwork in order to that deal with small business administration if they had a store or a business in the area, how to find housing other than in the shelters, how soon would they be able to get back to where they were living. So while as the adult agenda was going on, the kids could have a place to be safe for them. And just thinking that one other piece to share about that, the team that is made up of the caregivers, the Church of the Brethren programming for disaster childcare has a project manager. So there was one of the DCC, disaster childcare folks, are all volunteers. I may use the term staff, but they're volunteers. Who would oversee the team, be the liaison to the other agencies. So, for example, the Worth Street Center was open from 8 in the morning till 5 at night. So we were going to be there for those hours. They changed their hours at one point and said, "Oh, we're going to go 10 to 6." So somebody on the disaster childcare team needed to be in coordination with that, so we could be supporting them. And they would also be in contact with the headquarters for their agency down in Maryland. There was a lead caregiver. The kids would come in and be greeted by the parent, and the child would be greeted. The parent would fill out a form, give us intake information, any special needs that child might have, whether it be dietary or sleep. Did they bring food? We had snacks available, but did they have something that was going to be comforting to that child? And where the parent thought they would be in the assistance center in case we needed to get them quickly. We'd know at least which line to be looking in for them. So the lead caregiver would do that greeting and monitor that check-in system. The parents would sign in, and a photograph was taken of them with their child. And the parent was told that the only people who will be allowed to leave the facility with your child are the people in this photograph. And they thought we were just taking a picture. And when we would explain that, their shoulders would just go down. Oh, and it was sort of this. Okay, my kid's going to be safe with you. Because for the parents to just be leaving them with us was a big step, too. So the lead caregiver would bring the folks in, and then there were caregivers on the floor, and playing with Play-Doh, driving the trucks, following the kids' lead as far as their dramatic play. We were not mental health professionals. We were not doing play therapy. We were there just to be responding to the kids' play. There was a mental health specialist on the team as well, and how helpful that was, not only just in dealing with some of the kids' play, but also for the parents, because the parents are the ones who really talked almost more about what had gone on for them than the children. The children were playing it out, but not always talking about what they had seen. And having that mental health specialist be there and be available to the family to be able to refer them to other services that I didn't know about, as I knew about the child care piece of it, and I didn't know about all the other infrastructure there. I think that one of the aspects of this that was so impressive to me was showing up in New York and seeing what could I do, and through my experience, learning about this amazing infrastructure of services that are available to people in these situations. And you've both spoken about the hundreds of agencies that would come in. And I had an image at one point sort of thinking almost like a beehive or an anthill where everybody's got their job and they go and they do it. And Church of the Brethren comes in, sets up. We said, well, we'd like to get some formula because in case some people come in with infants, we want to be sure we have a variety of formulas. If they didn't bring enough, they thought they were going to be there a couple of hours. It turns out they're going to be there 6 hours. Maybe they didn't bring formula. Well, there's somebody from the Salvation Army who works with coordinating materials and resources and supplies. And the next morning, we had cases of infant formula that had come from a Salvation warehouse, a Salvation Army warehouse. The FEMA staff. It was just amazing to see. And all of it get like, okay, this link goes here, this agency here, and put that web together as supports for the folks. I think that was amazing to see. I will continue to learn more about the disaster child care piece and be involved with this organization to get further training for future disasters. Because that was such an inspiring experience, and to be a part of that. Similarly, the team members hadn't worked together before, but had to quickly come and become a team. But because of the training everybody had received was similar, I think that really made a help to it. And as one of them said, who had been involved with the disaster childcare group for a long time, saying, taking care of the littlest victims. The children are small and rely and depend so much upon the adults in their lives to help them through these situations that became yet another little piece of the picture of support services. So,
I think I'd like to just add in here something that when we were trying to decide how we were going to start, Mary Ann said, well, I think of the Red Cross. And I think it's really critical for people to understand that we don't work in a vacuum. And while we may have the longevity and the name recognition, we can't go out there and provide those services without our coordination and statements of understanding with all of the other agencies, the brethren who do our child care. That takes one piece of the response away from us having to provide it, because here's an agency that's very specific for them and they're the best at it. We work quite closely with Salvation Army, Goodwill, postal authorities, any agency that's out there that has a skill, or I shouldn't even say agency, group of people that has a skill. We do everything we can to try and get them incorporated into it so that without warning, at a moment's notice, we can in fact immediately jump to meet the needs that have come up with whatever that disaster has been. So it's really important to, if it's like, well, no, I didn't think I wanted to work with the Red Cross, volunteer with somebody else. You're still going to end up bumping into each other at the scene, and every group out there that has a role in disaster response has a need for volunteer and support resources.
I think another aspect of it that was so impressive was how much of this is volunteer work. There's some paid staff in any one of these agencies, but volunteers. And the hearing folks, when I did my child care training day, we were in the building where the FEMA had been set up, the FEMA headquarters there. And at lunchtime, hearing some FEMA folks talk about things that they were doing. Some of them were the paid staff. And the hundreds of people that had been responsive, both in the city and then from around the country, who were driving in, just showing up, saying, what can I do, in response to September 11th. But I think what is also so impressive is these agencies already existed before September 11th and will continue to. But it's about that volunteer contributions that makes that infrastructure happen. Yeah. So.
I'd like to just sort of interject here. I know I've had hundreds of questions I'd love to spend hours asking you, but can you ask the audience if you have some things on your mind that you'd like to ask of the panel members? So this is the time to do it.
Yes.
I just have an information question, since media doesn't do such a great job of telling me what I'd really like to know. I met a colleague who's living in New Jersey and whose community is overwhelmed with people looking for housing, and she's actually renting a bedroom to a single man who lost his apartment in these episodes. So kind of what's the state of the reality there? How many are people still in shelters in the thousands? Are children still impaired?
There are still shelters open, to answer that piece. And this is only the second story I've heard of that, but I know one of the volunteers came back with a woman and her 2 children who are renting a bedroom in a house in New Jersey. And the biggest challenge that the state of New York is going to have is, what are they going to allow, either FEMA or building codes, or how are they going to address getting by this need to build more housing and quickly. The other option really at the moment is people have to be willing to relocate, which is not easy to do if that's where your job is. I deal with this just myself with my partner. Every time he talks about leaving, it's like, I can't. I mean, this is where my job is. So that's going to be very, very difficult. The numbers in the shelters have come down tremendously. They really have. And you have had a lot of people. We have someone that is out here. His daughter was in Manhattan and was one of the ones running through the streets and is terribly traumatized and has just given up, is not going back to New York. She is staying with her family. I don't know. I would assume the child care probably is still going on.
There are still child care services at the assistance centers. They are no longer overseen by disaster child care through Church of the Brethren. They, that agency, actually this was one of the longest. I think they had almost 60 days of continuous services that they were providing, where usually they're in for about 2 weeks is what they're used to, and that's what their volunteer base has been in the past able to support. And so I think it was near the end of November, that switched over to a New York City local agency that was then going to do the training, and the Disaster Child Care Organization was staying connected with them as far as for training and programming. There are certain elements of the Disaster Child Care program that they really felt would be important to maintain. Some of it really just about the health and safety stuff that they wanted to be sure was continuing on. So they're having a consulting relationship with the organization that's now still doing it. And what I understand from the fellow who I've been in touch with said that the numbers of children who are coming have declined. That there's not nearly as many coming. More of the schools are open, so the kids are back in school, and families have. I mean, I think of a number of the families who came into the center, and parents are chatting with us, and they're like, "We're getting out of the city, or I'm not raising my kid here." So some have left with their families, and others have just finding now other resources to take care of their child if they have to tend to some of this business.
I think one of the primary things you have to remember is when you have your response agencies go in, we are not the fixer. We are the stopgap. We're kind of the Band-Aid on the gushing wound. And really, it is the state, the county, the community, the country, whoever it is that has jurisdiction, it is their responsibility to sort of make that final fix to whatever the problem is. We're sort of there to just stop the bleeding short term. And our primary role is with sheltering and feeding. And part of that is the mental health component. I know a woman at, I think it was the Amherst Public Health. We were doing some training, and she asked me about, if they had a major disaster and the water supply or sanitation was impacted, what were we going to do about it? And I said, call you up. That's your job. I said, I'll have water at my shelter, but it's not my responsibility to reinstate the water supply and sanitation for the town of Amherst. It's your responsibility. I'm just here short term.
One of the things that I keep considering is, the crisis is past, and now we're in kind of a secondary phase of grappling with this. And this whole notion of volunteerism has taken on very new meaning, I think, in our country. And so I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on what any of us could do or consider doing on a volunteer basis, perhaps, to continue the work, because there's, from what I can tell, there's so much more to be done. I think very often many of us don't know exactly what that is or where to put our energy. So I'd love to hear some thoughts from you.
Well, everybody looks this way. One of the primary things is preparedness is an ongoing. It's constant. It never ends. Every year I have to redo facility agreements. I have to reconnect with vendors and possible resources. Things are constantly being planned for. One of the things, as I said, with the new aspect of weapons of mass destruction, I've now had a new element added to my disaster plan that has to be increased. All of these things are done by volunteers. I'm a department of one, and I can't be doing it all. And so I depend very heavily on volunteers who have skills in organization that would love to take a plan and develop it. I mean, I've got the tools and I've got the information. I just need somebody to sort of put it together and make it a working document. There's constant connections that need to be made. There's training, develop community shelter support teams. I don't have enough volunteers on my disaster team that could respond. I cover 17 communities. If I have a disaster or a hurricane, chances are at least half of them are going to be impacted, which means I'm going to open up 8 shelters. I don't think so. I don't have enough people to do that. So I'm working towards developing individual response teams only for the community that they live in. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of creative ways to get around it, and I'm sure that the brethren are scheduling trainings, and you have turnover. I mean, there's constant.
I just wanted to add to that. I think that the response to September 11th was actually amazing, and part of it was that there are so many people who are already volunteering, and that there are organizations that were able to organize and utilize those volunteers. But I anticipate there will be further acts of terrorism and disasters, hopefully not on the scale of September 11th, but we need to anticipate that bad things can still happen. And so I think there need to be more volunteers. And as Mary's saying, there's just plenty of places where people can volunteer, whether that's local churches, organizations like the Red Cross, community teams like the Community Crisis Support Service that I'm part of, which has lay people doing critical incident stress debriefing. But the other thing I want to say is that, and this relates to kind of that first question, one of the things is there's a big ripple effect from this that's still going on. There are a lot of people who've lost jobs. That then affects their ability to retain their housing. So some people have been looking for housing because they don't have an income anymore. There were a lot of orphans and widows and widowers as well, and their income has changed even though they've received relief. And I think another thing that I feel strongly about is that there are certain things we lack in this country, like universal health coverage, or an adequate bottom for people who are poor so that they're not poor, and government support for that. Well, that really affected people who were poor or who didn't have health insurance after September 11th. They might have received the initial services from the Red Cross, let's say. They didn't receive it from me because I only was helping people who worked for a big company. So if they were limousine drivers who were out of work, or working in Chinese restaurants in Chinatown who were losing jobs because people were not coming into that part of town, they didn't have access to people like me. And so I think that that's another thing to look at, is what's our safety net for people in this country that supports volunteerism, but also ensures that people have ongoing access to services, because there are people who still need a lot of help right now, and that's going to continue, I think, for a long time.
You know, when you said about the crisis is past and we've moved into this other phase, and I'm not sure I would think of it that way, that the event has occurred and it's now part of our culture. And the immediate, you know, the phrase of putting the Band-Aid, you know, stopping the immediate bleeding. Okay, the wound isn't gushing, but it hasn't healed all the way yet. And just as you have a scar, you know, it's never back to what it was, and that's a piece of what's a little different now. Thinking that somebody else had asked about that part of, you know, and what are the ongoing needs and ways to contribute. You know, I would encourage an individual just to say, think about something you're good at, or that you're interested in, or you have a skill in, and then find an organization, because it's out there, that you can contribute to. And it may or may not be specifically related to September 11th events, but it's contributing, and it's going to then put you in touch with that network of other volunteer agencies. And that skill can be, you'll find, will be useful in a number of applications that may or may not be disaster response. Mm-hmm. It may be the ongoing need that people have. I also think we have a hard time thinking sometimes about, we're very good at reacting versus being proactive. And so, you know, sometimes I feel like, well, you know,
contributing time, effort, dollars to Band-Aids rather than trying to make it so nobody gets hurt again. And that's a whole other area of work that can be done, of shoring up systems that are in place for folks in the education system and the mental health fields. What are you good at? Talk to your kid's teacher and find out how you can contribute to it in the schools. Because that's every day, and that may be a personal connection, but that contribution makes a difference. And I think that's really important. It doesn't have to be a big, heroic rescue operation. It can be something that you just have happen to be something you've got something special and unique about you that you can contribute to somebody else. It doesn't have to be a September 11th victim.
Yeah, I just wondered what you felt about the recent media attention, Bush's solicitation of Hollywood to create movies about terrorism. What effect that's going to have on people and children?
Personally, I don't think they've been making all that great movies out there anyway, so I can't imagine looking to them to try to make something that would be more educational. I'm not sure that they're maybe the best choice. I'd rather see a theater or an art department in a college get given that responsibility, because I think they're going to have a little more care and concern about what it is they're actually producing.
I think maybe you could talk to that. What's the need to?
No.
In children's play, there's, sometimes the kids will make it be scary. They're in the pretend play. They're making something be really scary, but then they can take care of it. They can be the one to rescue, or they can be the one to make the scary thing go away. And I think of that sometimes with adults in movies. What's the attraction to some of this stuff? Is I want to see it, but I don't really want to see it. But I want to see it, but I don't. Is there any therapeutic value to some of these disaster movies or violence in the movies?
What do you think the negative effects would be of movies like that, where there's a kind of apocalyptic scene or apocalyptic movies?
So hearing the phrase about the television coverage on September 11th, saying, "Oh my gosh, it looks like a movie," because we've seen those scenes with the buildings coming down and the waves coming through the town.
I was asked when they were doing that September 11th thing that was on Sunday night, by I think the Christian Science Monitor, what I thought about it. And my opinion was that was good. I think a documentary like that, actually it can be very helpful. Certainly firefighters, for example, found it very helpful to see something like that and to realize how brave their comrades had been. On the other hand, for some people it's going to be very distressing, especially people who survived it or who lost somebody. And so I think, some people are going to have to make decisions not to expose themselves to that. As far as, fictionalized versions of it, I think we have to be careful, because I think there's a real high potential for exploiting this event. And certainly around Ground Zero now, there already are a lot of people marketing what happened and selling things and making money on it, and it's a tourist attraction. And for some people, it's really important to go down there and experience it, and for other people, what is the attraction? And are people taking advantage of that? I think another ripple effect of this has also been that we've gone to war, and we're fighting a war against terrorism. And there's always a balance between civil liberties and a backlash and what are necessary types of responses. And certainly the people I was interviewing expressed a lot of anti-Arab feeling, for example, including a significant number of people of color who had experienced racism in their lives. And I think that we need to be really careful about that. And I think we need to be careful about oversimplifying what needs to be done and vilifying people in a reductionistic way. And I think if the films do that, they could do a lot of damage. I'm very concerned about threats to civil liberties in this country. There's still hundreds of people who are locked up. We don't know who they are. They haven't seen lawyers. I understand the concern, but we also have civil rights in this country. Lawyers' conversations with clients can now be overheard. So I won't go through the whole list, but I think we need to really be careful as a society that we don't overreact in a way that does some bad things to innocent people.
I was concerned when I saw the documentary on Sunday night. Afterwards, two women on WBZ were talking, both lost their husbands. And they purposely chose not to see the documentary. And one of the women said she was not going to allow her sons to go to school the next day. And it was interesting because it just kind of was a little bit, I don't want to say shocking to me, but it just kind of gave me a jolt of, here were these people who had experienced it, and I'm wondering if there's a lack of sensitivity around their needs, and particularly in thinking about the anniversary, because as humans, we want to mark. You know, we had the 6-month anniversary on Monday. We kind of do these markers as after we lose people. And so people are now starting to focus on September 11th, 2002, and wondering if there's anything underway or any thoughts from any of your organizations on how to deal with the people who don't want to be participating in this anniversary in the way that we will in this country. There's going to be incredible media blitz on it. We'll probably do something here at the college. I'm just wondering if there's been any talk about that in any of the organizations you're involved in.
I'm sure at some point, one of the things that the Red Cross is responsible for, and it's a result of the Aviation Act, and that is, at the 1-year anniversary, it is our responsibility to see that a memorial service is conducted. Anytime we coordinated all the memorial services that were going on in New York as they either recovered bodies or as they brought people in, and we coordinate with whatever appropriate clerical group has to be involved in it. I would not be getting involved with it at this level, at this point. We did have a 6-month, but it was mostly because we had 2 people that lost siblings, and we wanted to acknowledge that it was the county that supported them. It was not me on the other end of that telephone all the time. It was the community that was out there to support them. I don't know, have not heard what's happened, but I agree, you don't want to sensationalize. And the only other thing I could say, as far as people not wanting to, we try to advertise and make sure anything that we're responsible for is well publicized, so that if someone chooses not to be exposed to it, they aren't going to accidentally come across it or walk into it. And it can be done. One of our staff very carefully curtailed a lot of exposure from 7/11, of September 11th, that her 2 children. Most of it, they've never seen any of it. She just prevents them from watching it. They're not old enough to really understand it and grasp it, and she said until they are, I don't need them to try to deal emotionally with something they don't even understand.
You know, a lot of research and experience has shown that when there's been terrible events, having memorials, having rituals, having commemorative events is helpful. It's a way of healing. It's part of the healing process. It's part of making some sense out of what happened, giving some meaning to it, and moving on. But I think the other dynamic is when trauma is involved. For some people, it's helpful to ventilate. It's helpful, actually, to revisit what happened and to go through it, to not keep it locked up inside of them. And for other people, it triggers them, and it really is terribly painful, and it's counterproductive. It floods them in a way that they can't respond. So again, I don't think there's an easy answer. I think there will be these events, there will be memorials, there will be depictions of what happened, and for some people that will be helpful, and for some people they'll have to stay away from it.
And for families who had somebody who died there, this is an added dimension to their grieving and healing process that they didn't choose, but is how it's come with this package. And hopefully they are engaged and involved with organizations and supports that are in place for family members to help them figure that out and strategize. Well, let's tape it, and maybe when the kids are teenagers, that'll be time. But maybe we don't want to watch it when they're 3. And helping parents, I think, with their kids, figuring that out, as not just parents of victims or family members, but just parents anywhere. There was a Friday afternoon, I got some material off of a website that was saying, here's some stuff you might want to think about
before your kids watch this, or as you're deciding about this, and trying to share that with the families in our child care center. Because some people are not paying attention to it at all, and others are still tuned into it. And so just having to make those decisions, but it's an added, I think, an added dimension for the family, the immediate family members.
I'm afraid we're going to have to stop today at 1 o'clock. It's another class coming in, but I want to personally thank you as part of the response initiative, as well as the rest of GTC for coming today.
Thank you for having us.
Moving.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.